Welcome, everyone. Before we begin our conversation, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping items. Live interpretation is available for today's webinar. To activate the translation function, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe and select your language.
Bienvenidos a todos. Antes de comenzar nuestra conversación, quiero mencionar algunos detalles. Hoy tenemos interpretación en vivo al español. Para seleccionar su idioma, hacen clic en el globo en el fondo de la pantalla. Si están en un celular o dispositivo móvil, hacen clic en los tres puntitos que dicen más o more y seleccionan su idioma del menú desplegable. Gracias. Thank you.
If you have a question, please enter your question in the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible after our moderated conversation. So welcome everyone again to Fairfield County Talks Housing, a program of the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. I'm Yvonne Klein, founder, and I'll be your moderator today. Fairfield County Talks Housing provides fact-based conversations with the experts and leaders in the fields of housing, affordable housing, and zoning. Today's topic is 2025 legislative wrap-up. This year's session was a long session that began on January 8th and ended on January 4th. The legislature passed a number of pieces of legislation as well as a new biennium budget. Today, we'll be focusing specifically on housing legislation and any new funding for housing and homeless services. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome our panel, House Majority Leader Representative Jason Rojas, Representative Eleni Kavros DeGraw, Co-Chair of the Planning and Development Committee, and Sean Ghio, Policy Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. So Sean will be kicking us off today with a very brief summary of housing legislation that passed this year, as well as identify any new funding for housing and homeless services. So with that, Sean?
Hi, Yvonne. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I will try to be concise. I'll focus on what was HB 5002, the major housing legislation that was passed this session, now called Connecticut Public Act 25-49. Still, it's on the governor's desk and waiting for his signature or other action that may come up in later conversation. So it's a very large bill. It's a composite of a number of bills that were passed by several legislative committees during the session, especially the Housing and Planning Development committees. But there are components of it that were actually heard in other bills. And just generally, in my time watching the legislature work, this session, there were more committees with bills related to housing than I can recall in my time here. It's a testament to how critical the issues become for our residents. So, as I mentioned, 5002, it's a lengthy bill, so I'm going to group some of the key elements into a few overarching themes. And I'm not going to include every piece of the law in this brief summary. So if there's elements of it that come up, I'm sure either Yvonne or folks can ask questions later on in this meeting. So first, there's several provisions around affordable housing and zoning reform, parking reform, that particularly significant, that limits local land use commission's ability to deny an application in certain scale residential developments on minimal parking requirements. There's a lot that makes it easier to build middle housing by requiring most zoning regulations to allow what's called middle housing development. If you think of smaller multifamily residential development like a duplex or a small set of townhomes. So this would require most zoning regulations to have those approvals be administrative approvals, basically if it conforms with the underlying zoning, and that's for any lot that's currently zoned for commercial use. They'll now permit those middle housing developments through administrative approvals. And then the other big part of zoning reform is Work, Live, Ride, which is a transit-oriented development bill that's been at the legislature for a few years, championed for a number of years, including by my organization, Partnership for Strong Communities. So we're happy to see that it was passed this year. And this Work, Live, Ride of municipalities are eligible to be prioritized for certain discretionary funding if they adopt zoning regulations, creating a transit-oriented district near a transit station that meets certain requirements, including allowing certain kinds of housing developments as of right. In other words, within the existing zoning approvals, administrative approvals. So then finally, the governor had a bill, Governor Lamont had a bill around priority housing development zones, this concept that new concept that municipalities can establish zones with minimum density requirements and as of right middle housing. And if they conform to the law, they can receive additional credits towards a moratorium from Section 830G, which is the Affordable Housing Appeals Act. Again, this was one of Governor Lamont's priority bills for the session. It was rolled into 5002. So there's a lot of detail in this, so I apologize if I'm going fast and kind of high level. But the second category that I consider is a planning and oversight categories, and in that you'll see there were elements of fair share bill that we've seen in past under the banner of Towns Take the Lead. There's a coalition advocating for this. And 5002 includes a methodology that assigns each municipality a share of regional affordable housing need for the region that the town must plan for. And there's additional details around what those plans must include. And for particular towns, typically some of our wealthier communities, affluent communities that don't have much existing affordable housing, there's additional planning requirements. There's several other things included in this planning and oversight category. I don't want to get into details now, except one I think is really critical, and it shows sort of the complexity of housing development. There's a requirement that the Office of Planning, Policy and Management, with the newly created Interagency Council on Housing Development, conduct a wastewater capacity study. This is a limiter to development in our state, and the fact that we don't have extensive sewer systems in large parts of our state, which have just contributed to environmental degradation and sprawl, in addition to making development much more expensive, and which results, of course, in housing being more expensive than it needs to be. Another category, a grouping of things, homelessness and support services. The bill includes a few elements that to help support people experiencing homelessness by making public spaces more hospitable, and by requiring the Department of Housing to administer a pilot program to provide portable showers and laundry facilities in a few communities to pilot this, to make those available to people experiencing homelessness. I'm glad that those elements made it through. There are other elements I passed through committees regarding folks to support folks experiencing homelessness that I hope we see come up in future sessions. It did not end up making it this far into this public act. Okay, next, rental assistance and resident rights. Fair rent commissions were again expanded in the sense that this bill requires more municipalities to create or join a regional fair rent commission so that their residents can have access to the fair rent commission process in cases of allegations of excessive rent and so forth. So the law now will require that any town with at least 15,000 residents will be required to be have participated in Fair Rent Commission. So I believe that's an additional 30 or so municipalities. I could be wrong about that number, so I probably shouldn't say it. It's more municipalities. Hopefully I can give you a more accurate number at some point. And the other part for rental assistance that's really critical in this bill is a direct rental assistance pilot that's being funded by philanthropy and nonprofit assistance. And this law makes it feasible for this pilot to move forward without jeopardizing participants losing other benefits they may be eligible for. So it's a real test of trying to improve the way we deliver rental assistance. So I'll be interested in seeing how that moves forward. And I'm getting close to completion here. I want to mention there's incentives and funding built into this bill as well. The most exciting one for me is there's a $50 million fund for eligible to public housing authorities in towns under 50,000 population to develop middle housing. This is really critical. Public housing authorities are tasked with housing our most vulnerable residents, are the folks that least can afford housing on the private market, and to inject capital funds into these housing authorities is a real giant step forward, I think, for providing lower income residents in a lot of these smaller towns with access to affordable homes. I'm excited to see that. The next step, of course, will be to see those funds get passed in the future through the State Bond Commission, which we will definitely be watching. And one smaller thing, but very critical part of the funding is funding for each regional council governments. There's 9 of them, I believe, in the state that cover the state, to hire staff to assist towns with housing development. I think this is something the legislature has heard over a number of years, that it's difficult for some of our smaller towns to have the technical staff available to properly plan for housing development. And this is an exciting opportunity really to deliver regional services for planning. So like I said, there's a lot of other elements to the bill. These are the ones I'd like to highlight. And first and finally, Yvonne, I just quickly touched on the budget that was passed. In the bonding side, there were over $1 billion over the 2-year budget and capital support solely for the Department of Housing for housing development assistance. There are other bonding authorizations made and for other departments, including the Department of Economic and Development and others that will, in the end, help assist developing more affordable housing. But in the Department of Housing alone is over $1 billion. It's remarkable and worth mentioning. I think we've had the Connecticut's, I try to mention this every time we talked about bonding. The rest of the country doesn't really do this very often and rely almost solely on federal tax credits to develop affordable housing. And there's a tradition now, thanks to the legislature and a few governors, of regularly committing funds for affordable housing development in each budget. So I'm very grateful to see that there. I meant to put a timer on to keep myself in track, Yvonne, so I'm going to stop just in case I'm going over.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean, for that overview. It's greatly appreciated. That was 92 pages distilled into a few minutes and a whole lot of work by members of our legislature and members of the housing community. So want to thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you again, Sean. So I'm going to turn to Leader Rojas and Representative Kavros DeGraw. There's been a lot of activity the past few weeks after the end of session. So what is the status? I still call it HB 5002 instead of Public Act 25-49. So what is the status of the bill? And, as you know, that there's a concern, regarding whether or not the governor is going to sign the bill or not. And within the community, the housing communities, there was an understanding that the governor's office did play a role in crafting this bill. So, of course, there's a little surprise that there is some sort of hesitancy here. So if we have the dates right, the governor has until June 24th to act or not. So here we are, June 18th. Where are we? And I'm going to look first to you, Leader Rojas.
No, thanks, Yvonne. And please, you can obviously, we know each other personally, so you can call me Jason if you would like, if you're comfortable with that. I am. But no, thank you. That's exactly right. Public Act, House Bill 5002, one and the same. The Public Act part of it is just kind of part of the procedural process that is the legislative process. So they're one and the same, but HB 5002 currently sits with the governor's office, and we've been actively engaged as we were during the legislative session, to the point that you raised, that the members of the governor's team did have an opportunity to opine, as they do with almost every bill that goes through the legislature. We do get an opinion from the executive branch, from agencies, from the governor's office, from the Office of Policy and Management, on things they'd like to see changed, things that they're just outright opposed to, things that they otherwise support. So they were involved in the process, but naturally, these bills, right, the things that make up this bill have been out there for 5 months, right? These aren't things that had came out in the dark of night, or even has been suggested, came out with a week to go, right? Yes, they were combined together, I guess, with a couple weeks to go. But the substance of the bill and the individual components went through a public hearing process, had a committee vote, all of those things. So there's nothing that's kind of been snuck in here at the last minute that's supposed to surprise people. So I think that's one important point to make. But as the bill made it through both chambers, what I call this is the world that we live in, the outrage machine certainly cranked up, right? And started putting a lot of information out there about what the bill does, what it doesn't do, what's the intent, what it's going to do to communities. And that's resulted in a lot of confusion for people. It certainly resulted in a lot of emotion for people too. And I think, as the governor generally does, he's taking the time to listen to a lot of people who have concerns about it now that it's passed. Certainly would have been more helpful to have that feedback during the legislative session. And there was testimony that was provided, but even original testimony on bills isn't always accurate after the fact, because often we will make changes to a bill in committee after we receive testimony, so that the final bill doesn't necessarily reflect the sentiments that are expressed in testimony, right? So that's often a mismatch too, that I think can be used by opponents of things to try to create a narrative that just isn't accurate. So we've been meeting with members of the governor's team on some clarifications and possibly some changes that he would like to see made to the bill at some future date, with ultimately the goal of signing the bill. I think the governor has been very clear about his support of the bill, what he sees as good policy in the bill. Like anything, I think there are some things that still cause him concern and cause others concern. But I think he understands the importance of the legislation. He certainly understands the importance of the issue that we're grappling with, which is housing affordability and access, and the need to, in order to grow our economy, to grow the kind of the types of housing that is available to people who want to make Connecticut their home, and particularly down in Fairfield County, right, which is just a wonderful, great place to live with great communities, but happens to perhaps be dealing with the most expensive housing in the state of Connecticut. And he understands the need for housing there too. I think he hears from the business community that housing is an obstacle to them attracting employees here. It's an obstacle to retaining employees here. It's an obstacle for young people to be able to find housing. It's an obstacle for empty nesters to be able to downsize, right? All of those things are really what we're trying to solve for here. And then you add in, at the end of the housing conversation, homelessness, right? When people are unhoused, and even just before that, when people are severely housing cost burdened or housing unstable, this bill is attempting to address that too. It doesn't address it directly per se, but that's the nature of housing policy. It takes a long time, one, to get housing built, two, to actually see the benefits of when we produce more units of housing. We will see the costs come down. We will see greater access in a lot of high opportunity communities. We hopefully will see less people who are unstable in their housing situation or housing cost burden. And then ultimately what we want to do is prevent people from being unhoused and having to live outside on the streets. And that's kind of where we are. So we're conversing with the governor's office. We expect to come to an agreement certainly before Tuesday. And hopefully that will give him the comfort and the understanding that will allow him to sign the bill, and knowing in the future that we're going to come back to this and make some adjustments that are needed.
Great, thank you. So going back again, we're still going to talk a little bit about this bill. And again, because that is a topic of conversation in our communities. So if you don't mind continuing the conversation on this. So, as Sean, really portrayed and discussed, that this bill has a number of elements that remove barriers to building affordable housing. And, and I think Rep. Rojas, as you said this, as always, these housing bills face a lot of criticism, and they're based on criticism based on a lot of housing myths. So that's something that we hear not only during session, but, throughout the year. And, as I looked at the bill, portions of the bill actually highlights what towns can already do right now. Towns can already build affordable housing. They can, through 830J, they have a requirement to write affordable housing plans. So, I can go on and on and on, but I'm not going to do that here. So there are a number of elements that are certainly repetitive of the authorities that towns already have through the Zoning Enabling Act 8-2. So how can we create a better understanding through, among elected officials on all levels? And this question is for both of you, among elected officials of all levels, that to create more housing, we need zoning change. Like it's just not going to happen. We've been doing this a long time, and we still come up against these barriers, which is zoning. So changing zoning will result in creating thriving communities that will benefit from economic and social stabilities that that folks have access to safe, stable, and affordable housing. So how can we create this better understanding of this zoning connection that we have to make this change so that the end result is more housing for people of all incomes to create our thriving communities? Whoever would like to take that first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Eleni go. I just wanted to comment. One thing I want to be clear is, right, we're not requiring towns to build, right? What we're hoping they can do is create the environment in which building can take place, right? And that's really the role that we have to play, because towns, in their defense, they can't control a lot of things, right? They can't require developers to come in and build. They don't have the financial resources to build it themselves, right? But they can certainly, much like we do for the business community, create the environment for these things to happen. And that's where the question of zoning comes in. There are a lot of things we cannot control: interest rates on mortgages, the cost of lumber, the availability of labor, the availability of wastewater infrastructure. I mean, we can control partly for that, but it's very expensive. But there are things we can control for. And we have long, I'll use the word we, many of us have long argued that zoning is one of those things that we can control for. And I'm always amazed. I have become kind of the free market supply side progressive Democrat, right, who is trying to reduce regulations and reduce burdens on people who are trying to get things done. Which is generally something that should be a philosophy that Republicans espouse, but in this situation, they can't bring themselves to do that. But to your question, is allowing for things to happen, zoning makes it that much more difficult for any kind of development to happen. And zoning is important, right? I don't want to make it out to be this thing that we should do away with. There are some people who would argue we should, but there is a value to zoning. There are some important benefits that come from it. But I will often argue, to what end, right? It's like the argument about local control. Yes, a lot of these decisions have to be made at the local level, should be informed by local people who serve on their land use boards. Absolutely. But to what end, right? And then the authority of the state and the legislature is reflected in 8-2, in which the state of Connecticut has a zoning enabling act, by definition, enables towns and cities to actually engage in zoning. So the state does have a role to play in the conversation around what zoning should look like, what are the broader parameters in which it should be implemented, but ultimately those decisions should be made at the local level. And I think that's something actually that we all agree on, but doesn't really get reflected in the narrative that is out there about what our intent is and what the actual outcome of the bill is going to be. So I'll kick it over to Eleni.
Yeah,
And I was
before,
gonna say,
if
go
you don't
ahead.
mind, Representative, I
Yeah.
just want to underscore 8-2, the Zoning Enabling Act, which gives the zoning authority from the state over to the municipalities. So the local zoning authority sits locally, right? So I just want to underscore that. And my apologies, Representative Kavros.
That's okay. No, and Eleni is fine. I would just say that if you look at aspects of this bill, there is hyper local authority in this bill. I mean, over and over again, we hear about the words as of right and that they can be triggering to people. But the reality is, you are still making those decisions. 91% of our state is zoned as of right for single family, and we don't have people putting out petitions and sending angry emails about single family homes being as of right. The reality is that we're getting nervous about as of right when it comes to middle housing, and those are, you know, townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, those sorts of housing, which I think is kind of silly in some regard. I understand the concern about local control, but local planners still have the possibility of calling those public hearings. You're still going to have conversations with inland wetlands. You're still going to have conversations about traffic and safety. You're not just dropping a duplex someplace and then we're never going to talk about it and nobody ever had to have a say in it. Special permits, you're still going to have those conversations. So I think that when we're talking about zoning, we also, you know, when you're saying like helping people understand it, absolutely. I feel like as planning and development co-chair the last 3 years, I have literally spent all of my time trying to explain as of right zoning to our colleagues, to municipal folks that, you know, are sort of on the outside of it or have just jumped onto a planning and zoning commission. You know, these decisions should be made within a community. What we are trying to say in these bills is we need you to start making these decisions, because that's what we've seen is a lot of decisions not being made, which has led to this about 100,000 unit, you know, depending on who you're talking to, shortage. And so we still want those decisions to be made locally, as the majority leader just said, but we have to open up opportunities for those decisions to be made. And that's where this bill, you know, really comes in. And we're grateful for many aspects of the bill that will do that.
And if I could just add, Yvonne, right, in 8-2, right, something else that towns shall do, right, when developing their regulations is promote housing choice and economic diversity in housing, including housing for both lower. These are things they're already supposed to do. They're simply not happening. They haven't been happening for a very long time. You know, that is a concern to me, right? I mean, we're talking about places for people to live, and not everybody can afford the house that I live in. Not anybody can afford $1 million home in many places in Fairfield County too. But we are talking about, I think, folks at the lowest end of the income spectrum, but we're also talking about teachers and policemen and firemen who want to live in the communities that they serve. And that's just not possible in a lot of places. And there's a lot of other questions that arrive from our inability to do that when you talk about traffic and transportation and environmental impacts, right? All these things are really tied together. And that's what's really driving a lot of our focus and work on housing policy.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate your reference to 8-2 and the shall. That is the shall in the requirement of creating housing for low and
And that's
moderate
existing
income.
law. That's not new law, existing law, right?
And it's almost 100 years old. So, you know, let's put this all in perspective here. So, all right, what didn't happen this session? And this year, we saw once again a big push for just cause eviction. And we know, and we heard early on, prior, you know, right at the beginning of session from the Housing Committee that just cause eviction was their #1 priority. And we saw a great deal of momentum behind just cause eviction from the Connecticut Tenants Union. So, you know, looking at that, it was a real grassroots effort to get this legislation passed this year. So legislators have asked for community members to come out, let us know how you feel, and they did. So what happened with Just Cause this year? How come we couldn't get it over the finish line? Thoughts?
You know, so this was a housing committee bill, which is why I'll answer because Representative Kavros DeGraw is the chair of planning and development, but she might have an opinion on the bill too. Yeah, you know, I mean, I remember talking about this bill at the end of last year, at the beginning of this session, and being pretty honest with people that it was going to be a significant lift to get it passed. Just because, I mean, I framed it in a couple of ways, right? One, the landlord community, apartment owners. I think most of the time we tend to think of these entities or these operations as being these really large operators, 100 unit, 200 unit, 300 unit operators. But the reality is many landlords they own a 2-family, they own a 3-family. They're more of the traditional mom and pop. And I think there is some concern on the part of many legislators about what the last 5 years of being a landlord has meant for people who operate multifamily homes or rental properties. And it hasn't been without challenge, right? The moratorium on evictions, right, put significant pressure on property owners. And a lot of these small mom and pop operators, they use the revenue from rent, right, to invest back in. Do they make money? Sure. I don't know that they're getting rich off of it. Some might be. But most of them are actually trying to put the dollars back into the properties that they own, right? Property taxes go up. Other types of costs go up for the owner. That gets passed on to renters. So I think if you combine all those things, there was just a general concern that adding another limitation on the ability of a landlord to operate their property in a way that is financially sustainable for them. I think people thought it was another step too far. We do know that just cause already exists for certain populations. So the other side of the argument is if we're already doing it for one group of people, why can't you do it for another? And then we are limiting it to actually, I think we were starting at 5 units or larger. I forget the number. It was 5 units or larger. So that was going to exempt a lot of duplexes and single families and triplexes that are owned. But ultimately, I think it was an aggregation of issues and concerns and things that have happened over the past couple of years, as opposed to just the bill in and of itself at face value during the current legislative session. And we just couldn't get there with the votes. And I know there's been a suggestion, there was an article that so many legislators are landlords. I don't think the fact that legislators are landlords, I think does inform their decision making, much in the same way that higher education policy, I react differently to it as somebody who's worked in higher education for 25 years, right? We're citizen legislators. I'm going to bring my expertise in higher ed to the table when we're discussing higher ed policy, because I'm going to be able to tell you that's really not going to work, or that's really what's happening on the ground when we have to implement the policy here. And I don't know that landlords should be treated any different. They have a different understanding of what it means to be a landlord and have tenants and operate properties. That doesn't necessarily mean they're making a decision in their own best interest. Often they're just making a decision based on their experience and trying to inform the public policy process. So I want to, kind of just be clear, right? I mean, it gets framed as, again, our colleagues are doing something nefarious because of the work that they're engaged in, or are they crossing some ethical boundary? I don't see it that way. I see it as being part of a citizen legislator in which 90% of us have a job outside of politics that does inform our thinking once we're inside the building.
Great, thank you. And certainly one of the, number of concerns, but one of them does include that oftentimes when folks are evicted, they're evicted into homelessness. So as we watch our homeless numbers increase, and I know the two of you have been, been supporters of all, efforts to end homelessness, that's also a concern, that people are being evicted into homelessness. Do you, either one of you, just in general, see that this is something that could come back next year, and has possibilities? I know session just ended. It's hard to think about next year. But do you see any possibilities for just cause, or do you see that it just needs such work, may not happen for another couple of years? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm going to just say I don't want to speak for the housing chair who's not with us today, but I know that it was a major priority of his. And I also know that he worked diligently to get the bill to a place where more people could agree to it. I certainly think that there were more people who understood it and were leaning in the direction of voting for it than we have had before. While I don't think it was enough to get it over the finish line this time, I don't think it's a us being landlords issue. I think it's genuinely trying to understand the best way to do it, what the right number of units is. And to the majority leader's point, I mean, I think that when we see that we've already done this for other groups, seniors, people with disabilities, there is a way to do this. We just have not gotten there yet. And, you know, maybe the further we get away from the pandemic and the moratoriums, people might be more open to that. Certainly, we are listening to those smaller landlords to try to make, you know, these bills better, as we do with all bills. I mean, I think we take a lot of feedback on these bills, and that's why, you know, we're, you know, certainly have heard quite a bit, which created 5002 this year. So I think that there's something to be said for the iterative process, like on a work live ride over the course of 4 years. In the same way that I think that iterative process will be important for Just Cause.
Good, thank you. So, different question. What legislation didn't pass this year that you were hoping that you would see passed this year? Is there anything or any funding you were hoping to see included or increase in funding in the budget that didn't occur this year? I know it's a different kind of question. Any thoughts? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I think there is always an interest. You know, one of the solutions to, you know, housing access and sustainability, right, is vouchers, and providing, you know, either increasing the value of a voucher for an individual to go out there and secure housing, or actually allocating more funds for more vouchers for more people. We know that there's a waiting list of thousands of people across the state of Connecticut who are waiting for access to one program or another. But the challenge with that is, one, we have the fiscal constraints, right? We didn't have a lot more room under the spending cap to put dollars in there. But it's the argument I always make too, is we're going to give people money, but where are they going to go, right? I mean, rents are so high. You know, how much can we increase it that it actually makes a I mean, it would make an impact, don't get me wrong, right? But is it really going to increase people's ability to actually secure housing? Is it really going to increase people's ability to have housing choice and be able to move to somewhere that they want to move, a higher opportunity community, a community with better resource schools? So without the supply, right, we're in this chicken or the egg thing. Without the actual units for somebody to actually go move to, I think it's really hard to say we should invest more money in wrap certificates and increasing the number of them and the value of them when there's really limited places for people to move. And we're also in this kind of period where rents are really, really high. Maybe they'll come down, maybe they won't. Housing costs are really, really high. You know, does it have an inflationary effect when we're putting more money into the hands of people to go engage in the housing market, when there's such a shortage of available units?
Okay,
I would-
thank you. Oh,
I was going
go
to say,
ahead.
I just, we did not do anything that was, in my mind, meaningful for the homeless population in terms of really trying to get at the root cause of what gets us there, right? We know that it has now increased for multiple years, about 13% each year. That's a concern. It's a lot of women over the age of 55. That's a concern. We're seeing more families in homelessness. That's a concern. So we have to really work towards meaningful changes there. I mean, I'm glad the Interagency Council passed on, you know, I think that's going to be really important, especially who ends up getting appointed to that. I think that's important, but I also think that, you know, there are pieces to the puzzle that we have to figure out, whether it's coming up with an area for micro units, whether it's talking about tiny homes, what, you know, there are other pieces to this that we have to really be thinking about, because we know that that population is continuing to go up. And certainly, you know, if we are potentially headed into a recession, those numbers are not going to get better. They are going to get worse. And I think that the face of homelessness has really changed. You're seeing the working poor who were able to hold on for a really long time. And, you know, we're hearing from our providers. I am a provider. I am in these homeless shelters and I am nearly homeless myself. Or we have actual providers who are living in their cars. And we know that our number is an undercount because we're not counting everybody that we should. So I think that, you know, it's great that we put in a pilot program around mobile showers and trying to remove hostile architecture. But in the grand scheme of looking at what other cities have done and states have done in order to reduce their homeless population, I think that we fell short this session. The other thing I would just mention, which comes up a lot, is newspaper notices. While it's not directly tied to housing, it's a big P&D issue. It's been around for a really long time, and I am hoping that we will be the ones to end the situation next year and finally get a reasonable answer to the newspaper notice situation for the towns.
Thank you. So we've gotten a number of questions from the folks in our audience. So I'm going to pivot and go to those questions. Okay. A lot of objection has been raised to the removal of parking requirements for buildings under 24 units. People imagine this will result in a lot of on-street parking where it is either prohibited or unsafe. How do you respond to this concern?
Yeah, one, I appreciate it, right, and understand it, and I've become something of a parking reformer myself, and in trying to apply some kind of rational thinking to it. So yes, right, there is that concern that if people can't park where they live, they're going to be parking on the street, right? There's a different problem that maybe exists already. There's probably a different rule or regulation that would deal with that issue. But what we're trying to do is actually just reduce the amount of parking that is ultimately required when a development is being proposed. One, because there's a cost implication to it, right? It costs money to provide parking. Often we are requiring more parking than is actually necessary. So what the intent was to allow developer to come forward with smaller scale developments, and maybe 24 units is too large, right? That's one of the conversations that we're having right now with the governor's office about it. But we were also coming from the place that no one who's making, or very few, right, people who are making investments of this kind are not going to have parking, right? Obviously, it depends on geography. It depends on access to public transportation. There's a number of factors that go into it. But even the lending and financing community is not going to finance a project that they don't think is going to be economically viable. And they're going to make a determination about viability on whether there's parking, right? So if someone's building an apartment building, they're going to provide parking. They may not just provide 2 parking spaces for every 2 units that's in an apartment, or 1 space for every unit, right? They're going to make a different determination based on the geography of where it's located, what are the other assets that are available, what are their projections around who's going to walk and not need a car, and ultimately the marketplace is going to help sort that out, right? Individuals who have a car who are looking for an apartment, if that apartment doesn't offer parking, they're most likely not going to go seek an apartment there, right? They're going to go find an apartment where there is parking. So I know I've been talking with more people about it. I think that's a hard thing for us to understand as people who engage in work in which everything is prescriptively laid out in words on paper. I think it's a hard thing to understand, but I'm trying to take a more market-based approach to this and bring some rationality to it. Because in addition to cost, right, and that cost of building parking is passed on to the end renter or the end owner, right? There's the issue of land. The more the land we use for parking, is less land that we can use for something else, right? Whether it's commercial development, residential development, open space, a green area, a park, that comes into consideration. And then there's the environmental impact. The more impervious surface that is required to be built that otherwise may not be necessary does have environmental impacts, because it increases the amount of runoff that is going into streams and into sewers and into Long Island Sound. So yeah, it is a big change in policy and how we think about parking. Absolutely, there are some communities that have done away in Connecticut that have done away with minimum parking requirements, and we haven't necessarily seen a negative outcome to that. So I think people are leaping to all the potential negative things that could happen. But we do include in the bill that if a local planning commission or a local zoning official deems that a lack of parking in a proposal would deem a health or safety risk, that it does allow them to have a different conversation about parking that needs to be required. So it's not there in absolutist terms. It does give some escapes for communities to force a conversation around requiring parking based on the reality that's on the ground, as opposed to having this pre-prescribed notion of how much parking is needed simply because there's 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, or 3 bedrooms, when not everybody is going to have a vehicle that's occupying every single one of those bedrooms.
Thank you. There's been a lot of misinformation circulating about the towns take the lead portion of the act. Specifically the ratio of affordable to market and the income limits. So some folks have said this will require 1 million new houses, while others say, as the act is written, it can't pencil out for builders. So what are the facts? I mean, I think easily we could say it doesn't require a million new units of housing. That certainly isn't factual. So can you comment a little bit about this, and maybe what about the fair share portion of the bill? Just make some general comments. I think that might answer the question.
Want me to go first?
Go ahead.
I was just going to start with the main issue is that there's a lot, the information out there is making it sound like we are demanding that X number of units are built by X number of time. And the reality is that this is a plan to plan. We would like you to plan for these units. And it's 25% of the whole number. I just was on this one of the Sunday morning shows, and the reporter actually stopped me and said, 25% of the number, that's not being talked about. So I think it's really important that that's part of what people need to understand is we're asking you to make a plan for the 25% of that larger number that came out of a study that had a very good methodology. I mean, that study was over the last couple of years. It's not as if we just jumped to a number and said, well, this is it. This is what we think it is. So, and the interesting thing is at the time that we were trying to put the study in, there were Republican colleagues that stood up and said, you know what, we do need a study. We do need to figure this out. So there's also the possibility that you can say to us, you know what, here's that number's wrong for us, and here's why that number is wrong for us. So I think that there are these, sort of pressure valve releases that you have when it comes to this portion of the bill. And again, the portion of the bills, people like to call it fair share. Well, it's towns take the lead. The governor has repeatedly said he wants the towns to take the lead. We are trying to do our best to work with towns in order for them to be able to take the lead. But what we are trying to say is you need to start moving in the direction of building. And I'll keep it short so that the majority leader can weigh in.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, I think the million unit number, million houses that have to be built, I think people are conflating 8-30G with towns take the lead. And I think people are suggesting that they're only using the model of 80-20, right? Which is kind of how we build affordable housing now, right? Some market rate developer comes in, I'm going to build 100 units, 80 of them are going to be market rate, and 20 of them are going to be affordable, right? So so if people have to build that 20 to get to their number, say your allocation is 400. So you have to have 2,000 unit developments to get to your 400 affordable units, right? But that's not a requirement as a way to get to your goal, right? Or to get to your allocation. That's not required, right? It could be that you build housing units, right, when somebody has a voucher. And the biggest thing is people are conflating 8-30G with towns take the lead. The intent of towns take the lead is to actually help people reach their 8-30G moratorium. If that's your goal for housing policy, I continue to say that shouldn't be a community's goal in terms of housing policy. But I understand why it would be, because people are so concerned about 8-30G. When there's an 8-30G project proposed in their community and how they feel it goes around local land use decision making. Well, it does that for a reason, largely because decision making has been made for 30 years, and we arrived at a point where communities' affordable housing numbers don't reach 10% of their units in the community. So I think that's what's often getting conflated. One, nobody's required to do anything under the bill. Two, the numbers that are out there are intended to be used by communities to inform their next affordable housing plan, which does not begin until 2027. So it's actually 2 years from now. So towns and communities and planners have time to think about these things. As Sean noted, we did secure some dollars for our COGS to be able to build up their capacity to help smaller towns and communities with their planning, with their thinking, with reviewing proposals. But that's the answer to the question. We're not requiring anybody to build a certain number of units. We're certainly not requiring 1 million units be built. We do empower and put some resources in there for our public housing authorities, which are locally controlled, locally managed. We put a number of provisions in here that are going to help communities get to their 8-30G goal if they want to. I know there's a question about work, live, ride. Nobody is required to participate in that. That is voluntary. You can choose to do it or you don't have to. Nobody's going to be stripped of their dollars. Nobody's going to be deprioritized. What we are trying to do is support communities that want to do that work. And help them build with their infrastructure, but not necessarily punish communities that aren't. And I think that's another one of those things in terms of how it's been framed of what our actually intent is.
Thank you. So another question from a member of our audience, Representative Rojas, you cited the experience of landlords during the pandemic as an explanation as one of the reasons for perhaps not passing just cause. Yet the demand for stronger eviction protections also has emerged from the experience of tenants during the pandemic who have faced dramatic spikes in rent prices, displacement, eviction, and rising homelessness. Is the tenant perspective being considered with equal weight within the legislature?
Right. Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And that's my fault for answering the question so directly about the landlord side of things without acknowledging the very real reality that renters and people, right, instead of framing as renters, are human beings who happen to rent a home, the challenges that they are facing with escalating rents. Yeah. I don't know if it's being applied equally. I know that my colleagues and legislators do care about the concerns of people, whether they're a homeowner or a renter, but in this case, a renter. Yeah, they are taking those concerns into account. To answer that question directly, yes, I just think in this situation, when it came down to the question of actually what was before us, right, a different determination was made by some members of the legislature because there were, a number of legislators who did support just cause. We just didn't have enough to get to 76 votes.
Okay. I'm just sorry, it just takes me time to look at these questions. Will the middle housing portion of the bill allow for mixed-use residential units? So commercial on the bottom, residential on top, as of right. So the commercial would still have to go through P&Z, but the residential units would not technically be as of right. So I guess the question is, what do you think this looks like when you have mixed use and who goes through P&Z and who doesn't?
Yeah, right. And that's one of those things where we want to allow for some discretion at the local level to be made, because certainly it could be about that a commercial property is no longer viable, and they want to move in a different direction with the piece of property itself. So that might include removing the building, in which point then up to 9 units could be developed as of right. If it's one of the things that we're looking at clarifying is making sure that, yes, it does allow for mixed use. And the commercial aspect of it would still have to go through planning and zoning, but there would be less conversation about the residential portion of it. Knowing that you can't completely separate the two, but right, it's about providing for some more discretion and not being so prescriptive about how these decisions are going to be made, while also trying to loosen up our regulatory process to allow for more development to take place.
And I would just add into that, I represent Canton, which has downtown Collinsville, and they've been very successful about having apartments above commercial. And some of that was they went with form-based code. So without sort of having a form-based code dramatic change, this sort of gives you that flexibility to do these sorts of things if you want to do them. Again, I think that that's how, if people can look at the bill with what we consider our best intentions and their best intentions, there's a lot of flexibility in the bill that can actually help communities become stronger, develop, better. As that COG piece alone, just being able to get access to COGs for help in terms of, we don't have a full-time planner, or we don't have a full-time zoning officer, whatever it might be. There are so many good aspects of this bill that will genuinely help towns move forward in a way that makes sense for them. We just hope that more people start looking at the bill that way instead of immediately being against all of it, off the top.
Well, as we mentioned in the beginning, this is the response that quite often housing legislation provokes, is, an immediate fear.
Well, Yvonne, can I just say,
Yeah.
I understand, even though I don't agree, right? I understand. I've said this often, right? Our home is probably the biggest investment that we're ever going to make in our lives. And I understand why people react in such a way where they want to protect the value of it, ensure that nothing is going to, impact of it. I mean, obviously, a lot of the research out there shows that advancements in housing policy, multifamily housing, isn't necessarily going to hurt the value of your home. In many cases, it increases it. And then people forget about the other aspects of it, of more vibrant communities, of more economically diverse communities, of having people who work in a community actually be able to live there and not have to drive a car to work, but be able to walk to work. But I understand, right? I mean, I grew up in the low-income housing apartment complex, and now I own my own home. I understand the value of that, right? So I understand where it comes from. Certainly, it's forums like this that allow us to, as legislators, to be humanized a little bit and understand where we're coming from and understand intent, so that we can try to get through a lot of the noise that quite frankly, just exists, primarily exists on social media. That is the world that we live in. And I know there's been concern from pockets of the state that have been expressed about the housing bill, but there's no doubt that it's primarily coming from 4 or 5 communities in Fairfield County.
Great, thank you.
And I even understand why it's coming from there, because of the explosive growth, because because of your proximity to New York, because it is congestion, because I-95 is terrible. So I don't know that housing is causing those problems as much as other public policy and infrastructure issues are. But that would be my response there. But we are open-minded about it and not completely like deaf to the concerns that a lot of my colleagues deal with directly, or that I read about and care about as somebody who doesn't live in that area.
Well, and as you know, we heard earlier from Sean, and as we've heard from both you and Representative Kavros DeGraw, the amount of thought that you put into this legislation, and just just the mentioning of when you hear testimony, a bill does change, and so some folks maybe don't in our audience and in the greater Connecticut audience might think that doesn't happen. And this bill is wide-reaching, wide-ranging, and covers, as Sean actually organized his thoughts around the bill. You can see how wide-ranging this bill is and able to touch a number of the issues that we continue to grapple with here in Connecticut for decades. So, and if we go back to the Zoning Enabling Act, almost 100 years, this has been an issue, right? To make sure that we're providing housing for people of low and moderate income. So we're going to end on a high note. What can we do? So what can we continue to do to get our message out, to forward this housing discussion so that folks are well informed and making their decisions based on facts? What can we do? How could we be helpful? And how could we be helpful to our most vulnerable population in the state who needs housing that's affordable? So people who are low income and moderate.
I'm just going to start by saying advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And that's with us directly as your representatives, as your, state senators, as the co-chairs of the committees that oversee these things. That, that's number one. I think the advocacy in your own community, showing up to planning and zoning meetings with a positive message, showing up, to other opportunities, or even, scheduling meetings with your local representatives and asking them, what's the plan, and can you tell me more, and what are we looking to do? I mean, I think it's more engagement, not less. I mean, certainly we're receiving a lot of emails. I mean, I would encourage you, for those of you who want to see 5002 get passed, if you haven't already contacted the governor, I think that's a good idea. I know other people are contacting him as well. I mean, we're certainly receiving emails, but I think it's, we want to hear your testimony. We want to get those emails. We want to be engaged with you in this conversation. But we do need your advocacy on the ground, because we can only, as you can see, can only do so much from where we are in these positions, but we would like to be able to hear from you.
Yeah, I've been thinking and talking about this a lot as I observed the onslaught of information or misinformation over the last 2 weeks. And it's a really hard thing for myself as a legislator and a policymaker to solve on my own. I think certainly, I see 63 participants today. I'm hoping that 63 participants who have a different understanding of the bill. It's hard for the average person to follow what we're doing and read 5002. And when it gets presented as 91 pages, this massive bill, but 25 of the pages have to do with this tax credit program that we did. That's 25 pages alone of the bill, right? It gets presented as being this monstrosity, even though it was a number of individual bills that were put together. I would encourage people to participate in these. I would encourage, I know this sounds so like old school, but read traditional media sources who are reporting on a lot of the work that we do, as opposed to relying on a Facebook page. And there is still value in those Facebook pages. I'm not trying to diminish all of them. But no, a lot of ones, and particularly the ones that operate fairly anonymously, you know, maybe question what you're reading on there, maybe dig a little bit deeper. And, you know, the legislative homepage where legislation is all there and publicly available does have these really good plain language summaries of legislation, which is very readable. And then if you don't understand something, email your legislator, right? And ask them for clarification on it, right? I mean, I know it sounds so kind of hokey and impractical, but I think we got to get back to some of the basics of civic engagement and engaging in democracy, as opposed to doing what a lot of us are doing these days, which is spending way too much doom scrolling and responding to, you know, randos and anonymous people on social media who may or may not live in the community that they're arguing, or actually be as informed as they're making themselves out to be about what it is we actually do inside the building and what our intentions are.
Or a bot.
Or a bot, right.
Not even a real person.
Great. Well, thank you so much. There are some great questions today, and thank you all so much for your participation. You know, again, thank you to our panelists, our audience, to our partners, the Housing Collective, the Partnership for Strong Communities, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, and Local Initiatives Support Corporation, as we work together to deliver safe, equitable, affordable housing solutions for families and individuals across Connecticut. Again, thank you all so much for participating today, and we appreciate all the work you continue to do on behalf of the citizens of Connecticut. So thank you again. Enjoy your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.